With Django, it's not always straightforward to deploy your app. There are a few steps you need to follow to deploy your app successfully. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly what you need to do to prepare your Django app for deployment. We're going to take an app created with Django admin start project and then transform it into a fully deployed Django app that the world can see. And I'm going to deploy my app through this video sponsor, Sevalla. Sevalla is honestly the easiest deployment service I've ever used. It has incredibly smart defaults that handle so much of the heavy lifting to the point where it's truly just clicking through a few screens and forms and then your app is live. Sevalla has tools that auto-detect what your project needs, so as long as you have common project files like a requirements.txt or a pyproject.toml, it will automatically detect when you're running a Django app, install all your dependencies, and run the app for you when you deploy. This means significantly less time spent on configuration. In addition to deploying apps like our Django project, you can also deploy static sites, databases, and object stores on Sevalla, making it a versatile platform for all your web projects. So why not create an account today and see for yourself just how easy and powerful Sevalla is. Okay, so if you're ready to learn how to confidently deploy your Django app, open up your text editor and let's get started. Okay, so to get started with deploying a Django app, let me show you the one that I have here. So it's a pretty simple app. It has one view, just an index, and I'll be able to post a video URL and then it will display a list of video objects for me on the same page. So let me go ahead and set this up. So right now I have no virtual environment or anything set up. So I'm going to use UV for this project, but if you just want to use a virtual environment and install with pip, that's fine as well. So I'll do UV init. And I don't need this main.py, so I'll go ahead and delete that. And then I want to make a couple of changes here. I want to change the Python version to 3.11. And then inside of my pyproject.toml, I'll also change it to 3.11 just to make sure it's completely compatible when I go to deploy it. And then what I want to do is I want to do UV add Django and requests. So those are the two libraries that I need for this project. And then I need to migrate everything. So UV run manage.py migrate. Then finally, I can run the server. So UV run manage.py run server. All right, and then this is the app. And the way it works is I can just paste a YouTube link in here, hit save, and then it will show me the thumbnail and then the title and then the number of views for the video. So I just added one of my videos. So the app itself is pretty simple. And you may have noticed the Git highlighting has happened here on the left-hand side. So one thing that you need to do for your project is you need to create a Git repo for it. So I'll just update my git ignore to include the database, so db.sqlite3, and then I'll go ahead and commit everything. So let's just say first commit. So this is the starting point. We have an app, it works in your local environment, and you have a repo associated with this app. You don't have to have it on GitHub yet. We'll eventually put it there, but this is what you need to start. So when it comes to deploying an app, the main thing you have to focus on is the settings.py. So I'll open up my example directory and I'll go to settings.py. And we see this is just a standard settings.py. I haven't done much here. I added the app to the list of apps. And then I added my YouTube API key at the bottom. That's it. Other than that, this is a standard settings.py file that you get when you create a Django project with Django admin start project. So to actually deploy a Django app, one of the main things we have to do is we have to make sure that our settings.py file works for both our local environment and our deploying environment, because chances are the values in the settings.py will differ between the two environments. So in the local environment, you can have debug on as default. You can have this auto-generated secret key. You could have no allowed hosts and so on, but in a production environment, that won't work. So we need to set up the settings.py file to work in both dev and production. And one thing we can do to start is we can start by creating a file called .env. So .env, and it's probably a good idea to add this to your git ignore so it doesn't get committed to your repo, although depending on what you put in here, it could be safe if there's nothing sensitive, but as a habit, you might want to put it in your git ignore. And then what you want to do is you want to specify the environment variables that are going to change between both environments. So debug is one, like I mentioned. And then we have allowed hosts. And then we have the secret key. And another environment variable that you need, and it's something that wasn't in settings.py, is something called CSRF trusted origins. And this just makes it so form submitting works properly in a production environment, because if you don't have this, it won't work by default. And then we'll need a database URL. And then finally, in my particular app's case, I need a YouTube API key. So if you have other API keys that you're using, like some AI API key or any other API key or just any other sensitive values, they can go in here inside of this .env. And we're going to replace the settings.py values with the values that we put in here. So let's go ahead and set these up. So for debug, we want this to be true in our development environment. In production, this will be false, and we'll handle that later. But allowed hosts, we can do localhost and then a comma and then 127.0.0.1. So that represents my local environment. A secret key, what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and copy this value over. And then for trusted origins, it's very similar to allowed host, but it includes the scheme. So HTTP:/ or HTTPS, in this case is just localhost. So localhost 8000 and then 127.0.0.1 8000. Okay. The database URL, we are using SQLite in development. So I'll do SQLite: / and then db.sqlite3. So that represents the location of my database over here on the left. And then for the YouTube API key, I'll put that in later. All right, so to actually get these values into settings.py, the first thing I need to do is I need to bring in a library called Django Environ. So there are many ways you can do this, but I think Django Environ is the best way. So I'll add that. So Django-Environ. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to import two things at the top of settings.py. So I'll replace this text here with import of OS and import of environ. Next, what I want to do is I want to create the env object. So I'll do that at the top. So right under my imports, I'll create env as a variable here. And then I'm using environ. So environ.env, so capital E for env. And then just inside of here, I want to do debug equals, and then I need to tell it the type of debug, which is a Boolean, and then the default value. So what this is doing is it's saying that even if it doesn't find debug in .env, it will default it to false. So this is the safest approach because in production, we want it always to be in production mode, meaning debug mode is off, it's false. So I just put that there. And then the next thing you have to do after having env is you have to tell it the location of your .env file. So you can do this under your base directory here, and then you can do environ.env.read_env, and then you need to pass it the location of the file. So I can use os, so os.path.join, and I want to join the base directory, which is directly above, and I want to combine it with .env. That way it knows where to read in the environment variables. And then once these two things are done, then I can start using the environment variables in the rest of the settings. So for example, for secret key, instead of having the secret key here, I can do env, and then I'm calling it with secret key pass in as a string. And then you just take the same approach for the other values that have a single thing. So for example, debug here. But for allowed hosts, this is a little bit different. So this is going to be a list of things. So instead of just calling allowed hosts inside of env, we have to do env.list and then allowed hosts. And we want to give this a default just in case we don't have anything. So the default will be an empty list. And like I said before, this one isn't in here. So CSRF trusted origins, but we have it in our env file. So I'm going to put CSRF trusted origins here. And the default value is going to be an empty list again. And then next I have the database. So let's go down to the databases part. And what I want to do is I want to replace this dictionary that follows defaults with just env.db, just to call like that. And what it's going to do is it's going to look for the database URL and it's going to pass that to default. And it's going to create a similar looking dictionary to what was just there, depending on the type of database that I'm using. So SQLite for now, and I'll use Postgres later, but that's all it's doing. And then I'll handle the YouTube API key stuff later. So let's test to see if this works. One thing I can do is I can set debug to false, and then I can get rid of allowed hosts. And then if I try to run my app, so uv run manage.py run server, I get this error saying that allowed hosts needs to be set if debug is false. So if I bring back allowed hosts and then run it again, we see now that the server starts up. So this file is being used for everything. But since this is dev, I'll just put it back to true. Okay, so we see here that the app works completely fine in dev after I've made these changes. So now deploying to production is going to be a lot easier. So let me close this. And what I want to do now is I want to connect to a database that is hosted elsewhere. So right now I have my SQLite database hosted in my environment here, but I want to have a production database and I want to test it from my local environment to make sure it works. So I'm going to use Postgres, and to use Postgres, you need a Postgres driver. So I'm going to do uv add, or you can do pip install, and then a Postgres driver. So the one I'm going to use is psychopg2-binary. There are a few different database drivers for Postgres, but this is the one I use. And then what I need to do is I need to actually create a Postgres database. Okay, so now let's go over to Sevalla and create a Postgres database. So let's go to the dashboard here. And as you'll see, creating a database is really easy. So I'll click databases here on the left and then create database. And then Postgres is selected by default, and I really don't have to change anything. So the Postgres version is the latest one. The name and the user and the password, those are all fine. The name is fine. The location, just make sure that you pick a location that is convenient for you and your users. And then you want to pick one of the resources. So I'm picking the smallest one, and I'll just hit create. And then I just have to wait for the database to be created before I can use it. So we see that the status has changed to ready. So what I want to do is I want to enable public access. So I'll just hit that toggle right there. So what this means is that connections outside of Sevalla will be allowed. So what we want to do is we want to copy this URL and then go over and replace the database URL with it there. And then if we take a look at the studio, we see that we have 0 tables in public schema, meaning we haven't migrated our tables yet. So let me go ahead and run uv run manage.py and then migrate. And if it connects to the database, we'll see applying migrations. So we'll just wait for this to finish, and then we'll be able to see the tables in the studio. Okay, so it's done migrating. Let's go back to the studio and just refresh here. And now we see all the tables, and the most important one being app video. So now let's try going to the app. I need to start the server. So let me go here and then start the server. So manage.py run server. I can refresh. And now we see there are no videos. So if I put in the same video URL again and hit save, it should appear here. And we see it's here. Now if we go back to Sevalla and we look in the studio, so let me just refresh the page, and we see under app video, we now have this one row. It has the video ID, the title, the thumbnail ID, and the view count. So we see that the database on Sevalla is working properly. So let's go back over to manage and let's disable public access. So we know the database is working just fine. So now that we have the database working, now we can focus on deploying the app itself. So we can get the app deployed to an external server as well, so anybody can use our app. Okay, so when we deploy our app, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One is we don't want to run the app on the development server that Django gives us. Instead, we want a production level server. And to do that on Sevalla, all we need to do is install gunicorn, and we don't really need to do anything else. So uv add gunicorn, just like that. And then also, I want to make it to where the static files display correctly. And to get that to work, I need a library called white noise. So white noise will manage the static files for me. So when I have them in production, it will show them properly. And I'll show you what that looks like later in the video. So we do uv add white noise. And to set up white noise, I need to go to settings.py. And then for the middleware, after the security middleware, I want to add white noise middleware white noise middleware. So the white noise middleware at the end, this is capital W, capital N, capital M. And then down at the bottom, what I want to do is I want to add a static root. So static root equals base directory / and then static files. So this is like the standard location. So what's going to happen is a directory of static files will be created from all the static files across my entire project, and it's just going to be put in one place. So now with that, we should be able to deploy our project with no issues. So let's go ahead and commit everything. Ready to deploy here. And now we need to go over to GitHub and make sure that this is on GitHub. So we can go to GitHub and then create a new repo. And this is what the new repo looks like. So I'll call this Django deploy example. I'll make this private, and then I'll just create repository here. And then because I already have a repo, I'll just copy this first line here in this second section, go back, paste in, and then do git push origin master. So this will push my code over to GitHub. And the reason why I'm doing this is because Sevalla will automatically deploy my app every time I push to GitHub, which is pretty convenient. So now let's go back to Sevalla and let's go to the main dashboard. And instead of a database, what we want to do is we want to create an application. So let's click create app here. So you need to make sure your GitHub account is connected to your Sevalla account. And if it is, you'll be able to find your repo. So Django deploy example, have a default branch, and then it's good to click this automatic deploy on commit. You don't have to change the name. The location, doesn't matter what the location is, but make sure it's the same as your database. So whatever location you use for your database, use that same location. And then for the resources, I'll just select H1. I'll hit create, not deploy, because I need to do something before deploying. So I'll just hit create. And then I get this screen here. So before I can actually deploy my app completely and run it, I need to set up my environment variables. So the most important thing I need for the environment variables is this. So I have the domain here, and I'll just click it. And we see it's 404 not found. That's because I haven't actually deployed my app yet. But I'll just copy this link, and then I'll go over to environment variables, and I'll click add environment variable. And then I want to put allowed hosts. So allowed hosts. And then I want to put the location of the server, right? So Django deploy example -wnu0q.kinsta.app. What you want to do is you want to remove the trailing slash, and then you also want to remove the https://. So just like that. I'll add another one for the CSRF trusted origins. So trusted origins, and then paste that in there. I'll remove the trailing slash here, but I'll keep the HTTPS. And then I'll add the secret key. And for the secret key, I'll just add one here, but it's good to generate something more complicated. So I'll say my super secret key. And then finally, I'll add the YouTube API key in a moment. Right? So I'll save those. And you may have noticed that I didn't add debug and I didn't add the database URL. So the reason why I didn't add debug is because debug false is the default, which is exactly what I want in production. And the reason why I didn't add the database is because I can get it to automatically appear. So let me go back to overview. And then we see this here on the right that says connected services. I can click on this add connection. And then I can select the service that I want to connect to. So Tall Silver Ox is my database. And then I can click on this, add environment variables to the application. So I only need the database URL. So I'll just get rid of everything that's not the database URL. And then I'll change this to be database URL instead of DB URL because that's how it's written in my settings.py. So I'll add connection here. And now I should be able to deploy. So let me go over to the overview page and I'll just hit deploy now. And we have the branch that I want and then deploy application. And then we just have to wait a moment for the app to deploy. It takes about a minute. Okay, so now the app is deployed. I actually did it twice because I forgot a comma in the code for the middleware, but the idea is the same. So I'll click on the app here. And now I see the save your favorite videos part. And as we can see, the style is off. And the reason why is because it hasn't collected static. So what I can do is I can go back to the dashboard and I'll go to settings. And what I want to do is I want to have a custom start command. So that custom start command is going to be Python manage.py migrates. So that's already the default, but I want that. And then 2 ampersands. And then I want Python manage.py collect static. So I need to run this to get my static files to work correctly. And then it's going to be gunicorn and then the name of the folder. So if we go here, in my case, it's example that holds the settings.py. So example and then WSGI. So example.wsgi. So those 3 things, I can update this and then deploy changes. And I'll go back to overview here and wait for the deploy to finish. All right, and then we can try refreshing the page here to see if the styles are there. So now the styles are correct. It's loading in the CSS and it's displaying everything correctly. So as you can see, there wasn't much that we had to do to get the app up and running on Sevalla, and it wasn't too much to get the Django app to be ready for this. So regardless of the method that you use to deploy, the steps that we went through the Django app always have to happen. But depending on the way that you deploy, there could be more steps. But in our case with Sevalla, everything was really easy to get set up. And with Sevalla, you can do things like create workers. So if you want to use Celery, for example, you can create a Celery worker so your Django app and your Celery worker can communicate. You can do things like create cron jobs. So with the cron jobs, you can schedule things to happen over time. You can create a job that will run every time your app gets deployed. You can set up things from Cloudflare like DDoS protection, which is on by default. And then you have a CDN and edge caching. Those aren't really necessary in a web app, but you can turn them on if they apply to your case. There are logs here, easy to view logs. So if you have logs enabled in your Django app, you'll be able to see them here with no problems. You have analytics. If you want to add a custom domain, it's pretty straightforward. You just need to make sure you're using the S1 resource, which is the resource that's directly above the one that I use for this example. We have the networking thing here. If you need to create a disk where the data will always be available for you, you can create that here. And then they have a web terminal where you can run code on the terminal inside the server itself. So as you can see, we can see my files here. So if I need to run like manage.py, I can do that. And then finally, overall in Sevalla, what you can do is you can create an object storage. So if you want to store like your media images on an object storage, you can. It's S3 compatible, so you can use Boto3 and connect to it. And then finally, if you want to host a static site, something like a React app or a Vue app, you can host that here as well. So that's it for this video. Those are all the things I wanted to cover. I hope that was enough to get you to understand what it takes to deploy a Django app. And you may have noticed that I was using UV instead of pip and virtual environments. So if you want to learn more about how UV works, just check out this video.